Hi and welcome everyone to this 1W-Minds seminar. Today's speaker is Axel Ringh from Chalmers University of Technology and University of Gothenburg in Gothenburg. His research resides within control theory, signal processing, inverse problems, and machine learning. And today he's going to talk about multi-marginal graph structure, optimal transport, modeling, applications, and computational methods. The floor is yours, Axel.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me. So yes, I'll talk about multi-marginal graph structured optimal transport. And what I'll present today is joint work with Yongqin Chen at Georgia Tech, Isabel Hassler, who is currently at EPFL, and Johan Karlsson at KTH. And the presentation is built on this body of joint work that we have done over the last couple of years. The outline is as follows. I will start presenting optimal transport. I think many who are watching this might know the topic, but also to introduce it to those who might not know it so well and set up some notation basically. And then I will move on to start talking about multi-marginal graph structured optimal transport problems. And then I'll give a couple of examples of why we're interested in graph structured multi-marginal problems. So some problems that can be modeled in these settings. Then I'll talk about solution methods for these type of problems, more specifically Sinkhorn iterations, which some of you might be very familiar with, and then solution algorithms for when you have graph structured problems that are actually structured over a tree, but we'll get to that when we get there. And then I will hint at some extensions, which is in some of these publications, which is extension to more general graphs, because here we have a limitation to trees, but I'll show that you can do it also for more general underlying graphs. And we'll also have an extension to, in some sense, a more general tensor optimization type problem, which is basically a generalization of multi-marginal optimal transport problems. But let's start in the beginning. So let's talk about optimal transport. So the problem was first formulated by Gaspard Monge some 250 years ago, and the idea of the problem was really transporting mass in terms of soil for construction of roads and forts and so on. So then it was really talking about mass transport. The formulation, well, we have an underlying state space X, which is a subset of RD. This script M plus of X is the set of non-negative measures on the space X. And then we have a cost function C. So C x1, x2 is the cost of moving mass from some point x1 to some point x2. And the way Monge formulated this problem then was to say, if you have two marginals, so you have some mass distribution, mu1, and you want to transport it into some other mass distribution, mu2, what you want to find is a function that tells you how should I transport mass in a certain point to mass in another point. So the cost of then transforming these distributions is C is the cost of moving mass, and you move it from the point X, you move it to the point 5X, so the point you're transporting to, and the amount of mass you need to move is the amount of mass that the first marginal has in that point. And then integrating this over the entire state space, well, that gives you the total mass, the total cost of moving this mass according to this function phi. And this phi then needs to be mass preserving, meaning that it needs to map all the mass from mu1 into the mu2, and that is enforced by this constraint here. Now, this is a very elegant formulation, however, so what it looks like is this. So you have a marginal distribution here, and you have another marginal distribution here, and you want to transport this lower marginal to this marginal here. So what you're looking for is this function phi on this space here, so that the way to read it is that mass in this point here, it's transported, you go up, you check where you land, and it means that that mass is transported to this point here in this marginal. As I was about saying, this is a very elegant construction. However, drawbacks with this problem is that it's a non-convex problem, which means it's difficult to solve in some cases. And there are also instances when there are no solutions to this problem. So in 1942, Leonid Kantorovich formulated a convex formulation of this and developed a duality theory. And he actually received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for these type of contributions. So what did he do with this problem? Well, we still have this cost function C x1, x2, which is the cost of moving mass from some point x1 to some point x2. We still have the two marginals. We want to move mass so that mu1 is transformed into mu2. But now we're looking for a transport plan. So m is now a non-negative measure on the product space. So m x1, x2, that's the mass you move from point x1 to the point x2. And in this picture here on the right, it basically goes from having this setup, which is the Mons formulation, to not only allow a function here, but to allow any kind of distribution here on the product space. So now how to read this is that this point here, it's allowed to transport mass to any of the points in the other marginal. And the important thing is that the total mass transported from this point is the same as the total mass received in any of these marginals. Now the optimal solution here is still, of course, the same. So whenever the Mons formulation has a solution, you get the same solution with the Kantorovich formulation. So more specifically, how the problem is formulated then in the Kantorovich setting is that now we're minimizing over this type of transport plans, and we're minimizing the total transportation cost, which is now given by C x1, x2, so the cost of moving from a point x1 to a point x2, multiplied with the amount of mass you move, and then you integrate over this entire product space. And then we need mass preservation. As I said, the amount of mass you have in this point needs to be received at one point in the other marginal, and vice versa. And this gives these two constraints. And the nice thing is that this is a linear programming problem. Despite the fact it's a problem in the measure space, it's still a linear program, which is makes it very nice. And then there are solutions to the Kantorovich instance, but where there is no Mons solution. And the key idea is that we're then allowed to split point masses. So I'll introduce just a short notation for this type of problem. So the optimal values, the solution to this problem, I'll use the notation T subscript C because we're using a specific cost function, and then mu1, mu2 because it's the cost of transporting mass between marginals mu1 and mu2 if we have an underlying cost function C. So much for the optimal transport problem. Now we'll generalize it to graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem. And to talk about the graph-structured problem, well, I'll need an underlying graph, right? So G is my graph. I have some vertices V or nodes, and I have some edges E, right? And I'll restrict myself to a connected graph, but that's not really a limitation. If you don't have a connected graph, you can split it into components that are connected. So I have a subset of these vertices. I call it V tilde. And for each of these vertices in V tilde, I have a given marginal mu t. So mu t is still a marginal. Now, I'll introduce a multi-marginal transport plan, right? So this is now a measure on the product space. So t copies, this script t copies of x on that product space. We have this measure, and that will be the transport plan. Then we'll need projections of this transport plan onto a marginal. So projection of the transport plan small m onto the tth marginal is to say I take m and I integrate over all the marginals except the tth one, right? And I'll use this type of notation. So I'll use a shorthand notation like this to say I'm integrating over all variable except marginal t. And if we just go back to the Kantorovich formulation, we see that this marginal constraint here is actually this integral here is a projection of the m onto the first marginal, and this here is a projection of m onto the second marginal. So this is then this type of generalization we need. Now, in order to talk about what I would like to call a graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem, I'll have a particular type of cost function. So the cost function is also from the product space into R, but I'll be interested in graph-structured cost. And they will always be according to this underlying graph. And I'll just skip saying that. Whenever I say graph structured, I mean according to the underlying graph we have. And what the cost, for the cost to be graph structured, what I mean is that it's decomposable as a sum where the costs are pairwise. And the costs are pairwise between some xt1, xt2, so marginals. And these pairwise costs are along the edges in the graph, right? So only along the edges in the graph do I have cost associated with transport. And then this is what I call a graph structured cost. So A graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem is then simply defined as, well, the total cost of transport. So using this graph-structured cost, I multiply the cost of transport with the transport plan, and I integrate out. That's the total cost, subject to the constraint that I match the given marginals I have for these marginals in vertices v tilde. This is the first generalization. However, when I talk about graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problems, I can actually introduce bimarginal constraints. So if we start from up here, that means that I can also have a subset of the edges, E tilde, on which I know the bimarginals. I'll need a concept of bimarginal projections, but, well, that's just integrating out everything except two marginals. And then in my graph-structured problem, I can not only enforce marginal constraints, but I can also enforce bimarginal constraints, right? And that tells you exactly how mass is transported between two marginals along the graph or along an edge. But for now, we're going to get back to where we have that. But for now, we consider the simplified problems where we only have these marginal constraints. And what we'll do next is that we'll see a couple of examples of this type of graph-structured problems and where they show up, so we can understand why this type of problems might be interesting. The first thing we'll look at is the so-called barycenter problem, which is a type of generalized mean problem. So if I have some underlying cost function C tilde, which is a bimarginal cost, maps from... Yep.
Do you want to ask a question?
You can ask questions if you like.
If you go back in the previous problem, is it when you have constraints on the bottom, is it clear that like this problem is always feasible?
No, it's not at all clear that the problem is always feasible. Actually, if you have a tree, if the underlying graph is a tree, there are checks you can have for when you have a feasible solution. But if you don't have a tree, it's more delicate to check for solutions.
Okay.
I've actually chosen to not go too much into that. Later on, I'll also discretize everything because we'll focus on some numerical methods. But you're absolutely right that at the outset, especially when I have bimarginal constraints, at the outset,
okay.
then it's not obvious that there is a solution.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we will consider this type of generalized mean function. So I have a cost function C tilde. So it's a bimarginal cost in some sense. It maps from x times x into r plus. And I have some known marginal distributions mu1 up to mu script t minus 1. And the barycenter problem asks to find a marginal mu that minimizes this cost. So in some sense, a mu which is close to all the mu t's I have. And closeness now is measured in an optimal transport distance with an underlying cost C tilde. This is one way to generalize what we mean with the mean value from Euclidean space. But as we'll see, we can actually model this as a graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem. And what I need to do then is that I introduce a multi-marginal transport plan. So the plan is on x to the power script t. And I'll enforce constraints. So projection on the tth marginal of m is mu t for all the given marginals I have. And then I have a multi-marginal graph-structured cost function, which decouples according to this. So it's actually easier to look at the picture I have here. So the gray filled in squares, so mu1, mu2, mu3, mu4, and so on, they mean known marginals. And the white ones, they mean unknown marginals. So basically the v tilde I had before would be mu1 up to mu6, and v in total would be 1 up to 6 and a 7th one. And the graph the cost decouples according to this star graph because I only ever measure distance along these edges here. So this is a graph structured cost, and that means that I can formulate the barycenter problem as this graph structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem. So if I solve this graph structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem, I solve the barycenter problem because I get the barycenter mu by simply taking the projection onto the tth marginal. That would be the solution to this barycenter. So this is one example where you have a graph structured problem, and another example where you have it is so-called displacement interpolation and in optimal density control. So to get there, let's consider an underlying cost function C of xi, xj, which is norm squared between the two. Okay, this is one of the simplest costs you can have. But we can note that this is actually the geodesic distance between the point xi and the point xj in Euclidean space. If this is the geodesic distance, well, that means that I can formulate it as the length of the shortest curve that connects xi and xj. So I optimize over all curves that start in xj, xi end in xj, and what I want to minimize is the total length of that curve. Now I have a control theory background somewhat, so I can look at this and I can say, well, actually, if I just do some change of variables, I can see this as a minimum energy control problem. So I have what I call an integrator. I have a dynamical system where the time derivative of x is just my control signal. I want to steer my system from an initial point to a final point in a time interval 0 up to 1. And what I want to do is do that minimizing the control energy I need to spend doing this steering. This is nothing new, and there's no new thing in this at all. But the interesting thing is that if you take this perspective, you can start thinking about introducing other dynamics where you take dynamics into account. So basically, if you use the 2 norm squared distance, you can think about that it means that you have 2 distributions. They consist of infinitesimal particles, and what you want to do is to take the distribution of infinitesimal particle and steer these particles so that they coincide with the new distribution you want in the end. And the energy for steering each particle is given by this. But if each particle has underlying dynamics, I can now introduce that underlying dynamics here. So I have a set of infinitesimal particles that I steer from one distribution to another, but they now have dynamics I take into account. And that means that if I switch the cost to just using this, what I call CAB, and then over the interval 0, 1, I can interpret it as a minimum energy control problem for steering a swarm of agents from some distribution mu0 to some distribution mu1, where each infinitesimal agent has this underlying dynamics. Now, I can interpret it as a minimum energy control problem for steering, but then you can ask, can I compute intermediate distributions, right? This would give me the total cost of steering a distribution mu0 to a distribution mu1. Can I compute intermediate, how the distribution look at intermediate time steps? And this is what's called displacement interpolation, and the answer is yes. So one way to go about doing this is to make a uniform discretization in time, right? Probably the simplest thing to do. So you discretize with some time step so that you have a, well, this script t number of time steps, so that script t times the discretization equals 1, because that's the entire time period. And what you want to minimize is between consecutive time points, you want to minimize the time for steering. So when t is equal 1, you steer from when t is equal 0, you steer from mu0 up to mu1. When t is equal 1, you steer from mu1 up to mu2, and so on. And for each of them, you have this cost of steering. And what you want to do is that you want to find these intermediate distributions for time points 1 up to script t minus 1 that minimizes the total cost. But this I can also formulate as a graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem. So I introduce a multi-module transport plan. I specify the 0th and the tth marginal, because that's the initial and the final distribution that I know. And I get a cost function that decouples on a path graph like this, because only ever the 2 consecutive ones are connected. And that means that I can formulate this displacement interpolation problem as this type of graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport problem. So now we've seen 2 of these types of problems, and I hope that indicates that there are a number of problems that can be formulated in this framework. So we'll move on, and I'll start talking about how we go about solving this. So Sinkhorn iterations, and then more specifically also solution algorithms for tree-structured problems. So first of all, what we have done is that we take the method of discretized and solve, which means we take our state space X and we discretize it into n grid points. And this gives us a number of approximations. So we had non-negative distributions. They will now be non-negative vectors of length n, so the mass we have in each discretization point. The mass transference plan, so how we transform the mass here, it will be a non-negative tensor now, and it will have this script t different marginals because we are on a product space T. So it'll be a tensor with number of elements given by n to the power t. The cost function, well, that also becomes a tensor, but note that the tensor still has this type of graph structure. So the tensor is decomposable in some sense into a sum of matrices. And projections onto a margin, well, this integral just becomes sum over all the indices we otherwise were integrating out. And with this, I can discretize my problem. So I have, well, the total cost is summing the tensor times the cost tensor times the tensor for transportation, summing all the indices, and I'll use shorthand notation for this inner product type notation. And subject to, well, constraint matching. So for the marginals that are known, I want to match them. And for the bimarginals that are known, I also want to match them. So this here looks very familiar. It's just that these are now vectors and these are not integrals, these are sums. So how do we go about solving this problem? Well, we take a lot of inspiration for what has been done for the bimarginal case. So about a decade ago, the paper by Marco Couturi came out about Sinkhorn iterations and the Sinkhorn distance. And what he suggested in that paper was to use an entropy regularization of the problem. And it turns out you can do basically the same thing in the multi-marginal setting. So what it means is that we have at the outset this problem. What we do is that we perturb the problem with epsilon times a function here, KL. And KL is nothing but the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the tensor M. And we have chosen to take as a reference the 1, but you can choose other references, but this gives easier computations, I think. So I perturbed my problem by adding this nonlinear function. And many of you might have seen this in the bimarginal case. If you haven't, this might look like a crazy idea to do first because I had a linear program and now I've turned it into a nonlinear program. However, it's still a convex problem. And the interesting thing that happens is that it turns out that by adding this entropy, you get a type of structure in the problem. And if you want, you actually get a type of sparsity. And this sparsity or structure you can utilize in order to derive rather efficient algorithms to solve the problem. Moreover, this structure comes out when you dualize the problem. So we consider the Lagrangian dual in order to see the structure. So I actually wanted to do this here and go through this step to see what type of structure turns out. So I have this problem and I'm going to derive the dual problem. So what do? Well, Lagrangian relaxation, I Lagrangian relax these two constraints. So for each constraint, a marginal constraint, I introduce a Lagrangian variable lambda, and I relax that constraint by adding it to the cost. And the same for each bimarginal constraint, I introduce a capital lambda T1, T2, which is a matrix, and I relax that constraint. So this is the Lagrangian for the problem. Now, what we want to do is basically we want to optimize this Lagrangian, right? We're going to want to minimize the Lagrangian with respect to M. So that's still a convex problem if you analyze it. So given dual variables, what I like to do is that when I minimize M, well, I can take a gradient and I can equate the gradient to 0 and I can see if I can solve that one. Because if I can solve that, that means I can solve this minimization of the Lagrangian over M. So the gradient or the partial derivative of L with respect to one component in the tensor, well, if you sort it out, you get an expression that looks like this. And the nice thing is that this expression you can actually solve. I can solve this expression for M. I just move all the other side to the all the other elements to the other side, divide by epsilon, and take the exponential. And that means that a solution for M takes this form. So each element in M has a form like this. And the nice thing is that here we now see the type of sparsity because M is a tensor in general. It's a T mode tensor, so it has n to the power t different variables. However, we see that it's uniquely specified by this tensor here, which we know, but also by the vectors lambda t and by the matrices capital lambda t1, t2. So it's a sparse representation in some sense in the terms of the dual variables. And in fact, we get a variable reduction from n to t to n to the amount of the number of marginal constraints we have plus n squared times the number of bimarginal constraints we have. So that's a huge variable reduction in the problem. Now, how do you go on to use this in order to derive an algorithm? Well, I'll introduce a slight notation. So if I go back one slide, we see that we have this exponential transform of the cost tensor t, which is a known tensor. And we also have this exponential transform of the small lambda t. And we have this exponential transform of this capital lambda t1, t2. So I'll introduce notation where I use k is the exponential transform of c. ut is the exponential transform of lambda t, and here x of minus lambda t, the exponential here is element-wise of the vector. So ut, an element of that, is exponential of the corresponding element in lambda. And this capital ut1, t2 is the exponential transform. And that means I get a tensor capital U, which has this product structure. So in some sense, it's not really a low-rank tensor, but it's some type of factorization in a number of factors in the tensor. All right, and with this notation, I actually can write that the optimal solution M that I'm looking for, it's going to take the form K, and this here is element-wise multiplication. So it's element-wise multiplication between this tensor K and this tensor U here, which is in some sense a type of low-rank tensor. Now, one thing to note is that a projection on the teeth marginal of M, if M has this form, that means I want a projection on the teeth marginal of a tensor like that. But since I have this product form, and since the projections are sums, I can basically write it as an element-wise multiplication between ut and a projection of a tensor. So U remove t, meaning a tensor formed like this, but where we have removed index t from this formulation. So basically, if I want to make a projection on marginal t, I need ut, and I need to be able to compute projections of this form from this type of tensors. Now, the Lagrangian dual problem is to maximize over my dual variables, or then to maximize over my transform dual variables of this dual function. And the dual function I get, well, by definition, it is the minimum of the Lagrangian for fixed dual variables. We have solved how that minimum looks for fixed dual variables. So if you take that and you plug it in, you get an expression that looks like this. And you don't need to focus too much on the expression. The takeaway is, well, I can actually derive an explicit dual function. Now, what I would like to do then is that I would like to solve these dual functions. I'd like to find my vectors u and my matrices capital U, because if I have those, well, with an optimal solution to the dual problem, if I can prove strong duality, by this form of the primal, I would have a solution M, which is the transport plan I'm looking for. So how do I go about to solving this dual problem? Well, one suggestion, which turns out to work very nicely, is to perform some type of coordinate-wise ascent in this dual. And what do I mean with that? What I mean is that you fix all the variables except some vector ut. And you take ut as being the only free variable, and then you optimize the function for that ut. Then you change from t to some t tilde, and you do the same. And you do the same thing for these matrices. So you fix all variables except one set of variables, and you optimize the other ones. Now, the dual problem is a convex problem, which means when I want to optimize over the set of variables I haven't fixed, I can then again do the trick that I can take a derivative with respect to the variable I'm optimizing. I can equate it to 0, and I can try to solve that equation. So if you take a gradient of this function with respect to ut and you equate it to 0, I claim that you get an expression that looks like this. And the nice thing is that what we've seen above here is that this type of projection does not depend on ut, and ut here is the variable we are optimizing over. And I have a very simple expression here for ut. And that means that I can solve this. So ut will simply be the marginal mu t element-wise divided by the projection of the remainder of the tensor on marginal t. And in fact, this is the Sinkhorn iterations. If you constrain this or only look at the bimarginal problem, this is exactly the Sinkhorn iterations. So this is a generalization of the Sinkhorn iterations to multi-marginal setting. And now you can also understand why it wasn't such a hassle to actually introduce bimarginal constraints, because I can do the exact same thing for the bimarginal constraints. I get an expression which looks very, very similar. It's just that now I have removed a bimarginal thing from the tensor, and I can update by doing this type of pointwise divisions, but now this is a matrix And this here is a matrix because it's a bi-marginal projection. It's a projection on T1 and T2 jointly. So I have very efficient algorithm because that means I can now iterate, I can do coordinate-wise ascent in the different components, and I can do it very efficiently. As long as I can compute these projections, I can do all of this very efficiently. And by simply iteratively going through the variables. So just iteratively going through all the vectors U and then all the matrices capital U and then going back, you actually get an algorithm which has linear convergence. So you get a linearly convergent algorithm for the dual, and when you have the solution to the dual, you can transform it using this relation into a solution for the primal, and you've solved your problem. Now the caveat here is that to do this, we need to compute these projections. And in the bi-marginal case, that's okay, but in the multi-marginal case, these projections are complicated to compute. And why is this? Well, so the question is, how are these marginal and bi-marginal projections computed? Note that marginal projections are sums over n to the power t minus 1 elements. So even for modest sizes of discretizations n, and for not too many marginals, there's sums over many elements, and they grow exponentially in the number of marginals. So marginals, we need to sum over n to the t minus 1, and bi-marginals we need to sum over the n to the t minus 2 elements. So for larger problem, this basically turns out to be infeasible, computationally at least. But for trees, you can do this very effectively. So we have focused on trees. So first, assume that this graph is a tree. One thing to note is that if you have a tree, then any constraint on a marginal which is not a leaf of your tree will decouple the trees into different subtrees, okay? This illustration here is supposed to illustrate that, because so the white ones assume that they are unknown marginals we're optimizing over, and the gray ones are the ones that are known. If this marginal is known, well, somehow there is no information flow from this side of the tree to that side of the tree, because this marginal is known and fixed, and any information only ever flows on the edges. And that means that I can decouple such a problem into one problem, which is this side, and one problem, which is the other side. And therefore, we will restrict ourselves without loss of generality to both problems with no bi-marginal constraints, because if you have a bi-marginal constraints, well, then you also know the marginals, and therefore you would not only have constraints on the leaves, and we will only have marginal constraints on our leaves in the problem. And in this case, the optimal solution takes an even simpler form, because in this case, this U here actually becomes a rank 1 tensor. So these are outer products between the vectors. So we actually have really a low rank tensor, a rank 1 tensor. And in this specific case, when we're doing it on a tree, you can actually derive efficient computations of the marginals. So the theorem we have says let G be a tree, let C be, well, that's the cost, which is structured according to the tree. And then we define these matrices K, T1, T2, which is the exponential transform of the costs along the edges on this tree. To compute the projection on the Tth marginal of K pointwise multiplied with the tensor U, well, as we saw before, that's small ut pointwise multiplied with this type of projection. And then we claim that this projection can actually be computed by pointwise multiplying over some alpha tk, where k ranges over this nt is the neighbors of the node t. Right? These vectors alpha, they're an ordered tuple, tk, on the graph, and they can be computed recursively starting in the leaves of the tree, so that if you are in a leaf, you just take uk and you multiply with tk, k, t small k. And that's basically a message passing. You take what you have in your node and you pass it on to the node t by multiplying with this matrix k. If you're not in a leaf, well, basically you take in all the alphas from your neighbors, but not the neighbor t that you are sending to. You pointwise multiply with the value of uk you have in that node, and then you use k to send it on. So in this small illustration here, if I want to compute the projection on this node 1, well, according to this, I would need alpha 1, 2, and I would need alpha 2, 4, because those are the neighbors of node 1. Well, alpha 1, 4, it's easy. I just take u4, multiply with k1, 4, and that gives me this alpha that I propagate here. But to compute alpha 1, 2, I'll need alpha 2, 3. That's what this recursion here tells me. So first, I compute alpha 2, 3 by taking U3, multiplying by K 2, 3, propagate that here. Then I can, using that, I can compute the alpha 2, 1 and propagate it here. And with these two, I can compute the projection. So it's actually a message passing algorithm on this graph. And that means it becomes a very efficient way of computing the projections and therefore overcomes this computational burden that otherwise computing marginal projections are in general. Right, so this is for trees. Now I want to go into, and here I'm going to be a bit more, I'm going to gloss over the details more. I just more want to illustrate that how can we extend this? Because of course I would be more interested in graphs that are not trees, and also then some numerical examples. So the first extension is, well, if we don't have, can we extend it to other, in some sense, simple graphs? Arbitrary graphs will be difficult, but at least relatively simple graphs that are not trees. And the answer is yes, we can. So there are general results on computational complexity for general graphs, okay? And it has to do with the tree width of that corresponding graph. And you can find more details in this paper. But let me just illustrate some other graphs and why we might be interested in it. So interest in other graphs. So for example, we can formulate ensemble steering problems with what we call origin destination constraints if we consider graphs on this form. So here at the bottom, you still have this displacement interpolation type graph. I want to steer a mu1 to a mu t, and I do that with some cost between each of these time points, but I steer it from mu1 to some unknown mu2 and so forth and so forth. So this is the displacement interpolation type graph. But I create the cycle here by enforcing a bimarginal projection between the first and the last graph. And the bimarginal projection tells me exactly how a mass point that are in one point here in mu1 is moved to other points in mu t. And that's what gives us this origin destination constraint, because I can say I want this mass that is in this point to move to this point at the end of the time. But then I want to do the steering as cheaply as possible with this C as a cost. And this is no longer a tree, but it's a graph of interest. And we can derive algorithms for this type of graphs. And I can complicate the picture even more. So I still have some type of path graph, which is a displacement interpolation down here. But now I have introduced some type of help node here. And with the graph that looks like this, I can formulate dynamic network flow problems of different types of commodities on graphs with an underlying computational graph like this. So I still have some type of displacement interpolation here, but I have some help node that keeps me keep track of the different commodities. I need bimarginal projections here to tell me what commodity is what. And then I can even have costs that depends on which commodity I'm looking at in the graph. And therefore I get costs that depend on both this helping edge and on the corresponding edge down here on the interpolation. I'm not going to go into details, but I can just say, and the details are in the papers that I cited in the beginning, we can extend the computations for these type of graphs, and they're still relatively cheap to compute, which means I can take my Sinkhorn iterations and I can solve this type of problems. Now, to look at the problem with an origin destination constraint, we have simulated like a exiting of a stadium type example. So this dark blue here, there are borders. Right? So we have this stadium here and it's filled with people. All the small green, all points here inside the stadium have the same amount of mass. And all these small green dots, they want to go to this green square here, which is some type of parking or exit. All the red dots, they want to go to the red exit here. And all the orange dots, they want to go to the orange exit here. But in these points, there is a fixed capacity. There's an upper limit to how many can be in the same spot at the same time. And there's also cost for moving too far, so you only take small steps in this one. We can solve this problem by deriving the projections that we need for this type of graph. And we can solve it numerically, and we get some type of flow. And we can illustrate the full flow of all the people exiting the different graphs, but we can also look at the flows for each of these individual ones. So these are the ones that go to the exit up here, and you can see how they move in different time points. And the same, the ones that go to the exit down here in the corner, and the ones that go to the exit out here. And with this kind of computations, this is relatively easy to compute. So this is one motivation for this type of generalization to more complicated graphs. Another extension you can do is that instead of considering this problem we had, where we had known marginals and we had known bimarginals on some cases, what we can do is that we can actually consider a more generalized tensor optimization problem where the marginals aren't fixed, but when we penalize the marginals with some convex cost. So GT is a cost, convex, associated with a marginal mu t, and FT1, T2 is a convex cost also associated with the bimarginal rho T1, T2. So now none of the marginals needs to be fixed, but we have a cost associating to having certain configurations of the marginals. This generalizes this problem, and it can be used to model many other problems to see that it generalizes this problem here. So the original problem, we can get it back if we let G and F be indicator functions on given marginals and bimarginals. And an indicator function is simply 0 if the argument is within the given set, and it's infinity otherwise. So if the given set, I take it as a known marginal only, well, I have a constraint here, which is infinite unless mu t equals mu hat, and that's the same as having a constraint. If I do that for all the marginals and bimarginals, I recover this problem. But you can also use this generalization to handle other problems, such as unbalanced optimal transport. This can be some type of deviation. Instead of exactly enforcing matching on some marginals, you can have deviation from some known marginal. And the same for the bimarginal case, of course. We can do mean field type control problems with multiple species. And one applications which I'm interested in, I don't know if actually someone has done it, maybe someone has, if then I might have missed it, but you could use this for spatial temporal inverse problems, I'm pretty sure. Because if you have a spatial temporal inverse problems, you would have some data that you acquire at each time point, BT. You have a forward operator acting on your underlying unknown. The underlying unknown is mu t, and you have some cost associating, well, data mismatch term at each time point. But if you have a spatial temporal inverse problem, you also know that there is some type of deformation relating to marginals with each other. So you would have this type of cost connecting marginal mu t with marginal mu t plus 1, and you could use an optimal transport cost here. And this here, you can reformulate that into exactly this type of tensor optimization problem. And the nice thing is that it turns out that even when you do this tensor optimization problem, the solution structure is the same as for this type of original problem. And what we did in order to derive an algorithm for this original problem was to dualize and then do coordinate ascent in the dual. But you can do something very, very similar in this one. So you can dualize the problem, you get the same type of solution structure, and then you can consider algorithms which are basically dual coordinate ascent in the dual. And those still gives you, in some senses, in some cases at least, relatively computationally efficient algorithms to solve the problem. So we can take algorithms for this problem and we can generalize them to algorithms for this problem. Now, what I wanted to do was to, in slightly more detail, go through an example of how we can do this for mean field type control problems or density type control problems with multiple species. I'm not sure I'll have time to go through all of it in details, but maybe I'll be a bit quick on it. So we have a setup where we have L different types of agents. And each of these agents is controlled by this stochastic differential equation. So I have some drift, FL, XL, and then I have a control, VL times VL, and I have noise entering into the system. So square root of epsilon dWL, where this here is a Brownian motion. Now, the distribution, if you have agents, if they start with some known distribution at time point 0, the distribution of agents at a later time point, the density of those agents will be described by solutions to the Fokker-Planck equation, right? And that's this equation here. With this in mind, I can formulate a multi-species density control problem as controlling densities of multiple species to minimize some type of cost. So let's look at the constraints first. This is the Fokker-Planck equation for all the different species. So small l is 1 up to capital L. This is the Fokker-Planck equation, meaning that my densities need to obey this equation. But note that V here, I'm optimizing over that one. That's the control signal. That's the one I want to select. So I can steer the system. They all have a given initial distribution, And then I have this rho t, which is the sum of all the distributions, so the total mass of all the distributions of agents. Now I want to minimize a sum of three different types of term. First of all, I want to have I have a term which is control energy. So VL in a point is the amount of control I'm using in that point to steer a certain species. Norm squared, well, the norm squared is the amount of energy or the amount of control I need in that point. I multiply with the density, the amount of agents I have in that point, and I integrate over the entire space, and that's an instant amount of control I need at the current moment to steer my agent. And then I integrate over the time period where I'm steering, so I'm steering in a time period 0 up to 1, and that's the total amount of control I need to steer a species L. And then summing over all the species, that's the total control energy. This term here is some type of cooperative cost. This is a running cost, which penalizes somehow different configurations of the total density. And I can also have some type of cost associated with the final distribution of the agents, of the total density. Analogously, I can have a similar running cost and final cost associated to each individual. So then this is individual species cost, and this here is a cooperative cost. At the outset, this doesn't look like it. This might not at all look like it has a lot to do with optimal transport. But if you discretize this, let me be a bit quick. If you discretize this and analyze the problem, it turns out that the discrete version of this problem can be formulated like this. So basically, from the discrete total energy, you get a tensor type, or you get a linear type thing here with the tensor C, and M here is the amount of, it's a tensor, and it's the amount of species L that goes through the time points I0 up to I1 up to I2 all the way up to IT. So it's the tensor that describes how we steer all the different agents. And the discrete version of the control energy, it's basically a linear term like this, plus exactly this type of entropy term that we had in the problem. And this here are marginal and bimarginal costs. And then I do that subject to some marginal and bimarginal constraints. And I get some type of computational graph, which is actually now, if you have multiple species, it's not even a graph anymore, it's a hypergraph. And that's why these areas here are colored in. But I'm skimming over the details and just hinting at that discretizing this problem, you get some type of structured tensor optimization problem of the form that we have derived solution methods for. So let me instead go to an example to see what we can do. In this example, it's some type of, well, search and rescue example. So we have set up a setup where we have 3 different types of robots. And the goal is to, by the end of the final time, they should basically cover the entire area so that you know what you have in this area, right? The cost that the robots are associated with is a cost of moving, and this is different for the different robots. They have a cost for being outside the starting area, meaning if you deploy a robot, as long as it's outside in this mission, you're paying a certain cost for it, right? And this could be some type of wear and tear cost, right? If you're deploying something, there's a cost associated. And then we add a congestion cost, and this is a nonlinear convex cost, and it's in order to not get congested areas when these robots spread out. So more specifically, I have robots in a starting red area here. They are robot type 2. They can move in the green area, which is some type of normal area, but they can also move in this light colored red area, which is some type of rough terrain. I have robots in a starting area blue here. They're robot type 1. They can also move in the green area, but they can also move in this blue area, which could represent water. So they could be some type of amphibious robots. And then we have robot type 3, which they start here in the black area. They can only move in the green area, but they are faster, meaning they can move longer in each time instance, and they have a lower cost when they're moving. So they're cheaper robots, but they're not as flexible. And the question is basically, how should you deploy this in order to cover the area within a given time frame? We can formulate this problem. We can set it up like a problem on this form that I have here, and we can solve it using the algorithms that we've developed. And we get solutions, well, in this case, with some parameter values, we can get a solution like this, where we have both the total density. And here you can see that sure, there is congestion, a bit of congestion at some points. So the congestion does not penalize the initial areas, and that's why you see a high density of robots in the initial areas. There is some congestion at some time instances directly here in this area where everyone needs to get out. And of course, in these small corridors where the black robots need to go, because if we go back, if these robots want to get to this area, they either need to go through this corridor or they need to go around all the way like that. And of course, then we get some congestion. It's a trade-off where they want to spread out on this area. But as we see, we can analyze the different solutions. I'm not going to analyze them too much in detail, but what happens is that the robots that can only move in water, to cover the area up here, they need to move quite far. So we start letting them out before we start letting out the other robots. And this is probably to minimize the congestion. And at the final time point, they cover exactly these areas. The robots that can move in rough terrain, well, they're used to move to cover the rough terrain, but also some areas that are quite far away for the other robots. And the cheap ones, they are used to cover most of the area, but obviously there are certain areas they cannot cover. So this is actually what I wanted to tell you about. So let me actually just have a short wrap up and take an outlook. So my hope, what I have done with this talk, is that I've introduced graph-structured multi-marginal optimal transport. I've hopefully illustrated that there is actually a number of problems that are of interest that can be models as such problems. I presented iterative solution methods when you have tree-structured costs for the multi-marginal graph-structured optimal transport problems. And then I've indicated extensions, and again, more details in the papers, how we can do it for more general graphs, at least when they're somewhat simple, and actually, in some sense, also on hypergraphs. And I've also indicated extensions and examples where we can do it with not fixed known marginals necessarily, but when we have convex cost associated to the marginals. There are plenty of ways in which we are still looking into the problem and in which other people can look at. So if you know Sinkhorn iterations, you know that there is a certain amount of numerical instability for small values of epsilon. I would still argue that it's somewhat open how this can be rectified in the multi-marginal setting, efficient algorithms so that can be solved for small values of epsilon. I mentioned it before, it would be interesting to have a look at some spatial temporal problems where this could be relevant to formulate. There's also a link between this. So there is a duality between optimal steering and optimal inference. So the optimal path of a robot is also the most, in some sense, the most likely path for a stochastic process to take. And that means that one could start asking questions about maximum likelihood interpretations, and potentially then if you see like densities evolving, could you use this maximum likelihood interpretation to do some type of parameter estimation, like maximum a posteriori or something like that, to do system identification. And there's also potentially many other ways in which this can be generalized. But with that, I just want to say thank you very much for attentions, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for this great talk. I'll start with one question, and then we can take others from the audience later.
Yep.
So my question is basically, when you do this restriction to these simple graphs,
yes,
are there any interesting problems that you then exclude?
I would say yes, most likely, but we are also somewhat looking into what type of different graphs you can have. So for this steering, it actually turns out to be even a hypergraph, but it's a bit of a two-sided thing. We're also exploring a bit on like what type of graphs, what type of problems can be modeled in such a framework. So let me go back to this where we have the graphs. What type of problems can be modeled in this framework in general, and what type of underlying graphs would that mean? And basically for the multi-species case, it turned out that it wasn't a graph, it was a hypergraph. So my short answer is yes, probably. I don't have any straight up, but I'm sure there must be interesting problems we are restricting ourselves from.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, I'd like to follow up on a question. Something I didn't quite understand. Actually, I don't really fully understand the algorithm, but it appears to me that there's some sort of update step that seemed to be like some sort of message passing.
Yep.
What happens if there are, let's say, other graphs that have a cycle. So just maybe I don't quite understand what happens.
So this is the interesting. So when you have a tree, it's really a message passing algorithm. But for a graph like cycle like this, it's somehow it's still message passing. But my background is more optimization, so I really rather like to see it as we're doing coordinate wise. We're doing coordinate wise optimization, and you can do this. So if I go back, basically in this message passing, what you do is a sequential elimination of variable to get to the fact that basically what you want to do is to take the information from the leaves and drag them into the point where you want to do the projection.
Yes.
It works. I mean, it's basically an analysis on each type of graphs. That's why I didn't go through it on these graphs exactly how it looked. But you can, if you know that that's the type of idea you want, you can pose a graph like this and you can start analyzing, if I want to do this, can I still do these projections in somewhat efficient way? And basically it turns out that yes, you can compute these projections in similar ways. The difference though is that if we go back to this graph here, in the message passing, if you are very careful, you see that I only ever need to do this K is a matrix and this U is a vector. And I only ever need to do matrix vector operations or pointwise multiplications between vectors.
Yes.
When I get into these more complicated ones, this is no longer true. In these type of graphs, I might have to do matrix operations, or I will have to do matrix operations.
Okay.
So the complexity of computing the projections grows, but matrix still fine.
Okay. So does it mean if there are like clicks, big clicks in the graphs, that they'll be problematic?
Yes. So they this paper, what it really does is that to derive this one, what they did was that they looked at oh, now I forgot what the name is, but you associate it into clicks, right? And the tree width has to do with how many nodes you have in this type of these different clicks. And the tree width really turns out to be the deciding factor on how complicated or how numerically expensive it is to compute these projections.
Interesting. Okay. So another maybe a simple question. You know, the example you have the stadium. I didn't. Can you tell me how you formulate this as optimal, like this optimal transfer problem? It's a nice, interesting question. I just didn't see how this was. Yeah.
So what we said is that we have this bimarginal constraint, and the bimarginal constraint describes that everything which is green inside here needs to go to that green area. Everything which is red here needs to go to the red area, and everything which is yellow here needs to go down. And that's why we need this type of circle then. And that's what I mean with that. With this type of circles, we can do origin destination in terms of that we can specify that starting somewhere means that you need to end somewhere. And this bimarginal constraint here is really what enforces that. Then in this example, we've actually played with C as well, because I didn't talk about it, but you can allow C to have infinity as certain entries. And then you're basically blocking mass from moving into certain points at certain times. And the algorithm still works fine, because if C has infinite entries, if I go back to the definition of K is the exponential transform of C. And if formally here, but it turns out to be working, if C is infinity, then K is 0. Right? If I informally interpret exponential of minus infinity to be 0, and this turns out to be valid. This basically turns out to be an okay thing to do, which means that you can have infinite entries. In those cases, if you want to guarantee existence of solution, you need to be more careful. Because at that point, it becomes harder to guarantee that I always have a solution in its own. If C has certain other structure with no infinite elements and so on, I can more easily guarantee that I have solutions. But if it has infinite values, I can't as easily do that. But you can construct example where you have solutions like this one. And then we have this is technically not the marginal constraint, right? This is actually a capacity constraint. So it's more similar to this extension. But now I have an indicator function on a set saying that if mu takes larger values, then it's infinity. So it's still some type of indicator function, but it's the simplest type of indicator function. And then we can formulate the problem like this.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Then I think we wrap up for today. Thank you again, Axel. And for people on YouTube, see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.